Now he could have that persona in a simulation have certain limitations that his persona as the programmer is not limited by. Right? What's the problem?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I've never gotten what's supposed to be the problem with the hypostatic union. People never can like articulate the problem precisely enough for me to like
I'm not
understand
troubled by what
what it's
I
supposed
don't
to be.
understand. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm not one of these people who think, well, because I don't understand it, therefore it's not coherent.
I guess one kind of puzzle might be like when Christ is walking around, does he have like his understanding and he has like thoughts? Are those like his
That
human
is not
body only
something we
has the human thoughts?
it's not something that we can answer.
There's like angels on the head of a pin, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, there are some theologians who have worked hard in trying to derive ramifications, implications from what the Bible teaches about the hypostatic union. There's nothing wrong in that pursuit, but at the end of the day, as smart as some of these theologians are and have toiled for many years, both past and present, we're never going to have all the answers because we're not God.
What do you think of
I mean, one more thing. I mean, there are just some questions that can never be answered. Like, why didn't Rosie O'Donnell's parents give her up for adoption? This is baffling.
um I was going to ask you a question just based on your formulation. You were talking to the guy earlier about like kind of what is and isn't God, is like the thing that he's calling God, is that really God? So wondering what you thought of Paul Tillich's definition of God as the ground of being.
Whose definition?
Paul Tillich, T I
Oh,
L L I
Tillich.
C H.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah. I thought you were saying in one word. I thought you were saying politics. Paul Tillich.
yeah,
Okay, yeah.
Paul
Okay,
Tillich.
Tillich
Yeah,
the theologian. Yeah,
yeah.
that's an interesting formalization. Yeah, I think that is it's a description that's very worthy. Yeah, I use that. I say that God is the ground of all being.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
but Tillich, I don't know enough about. I mean, I read about him more many years ago, and I'm really rusty on Tillich's theology. But
He's probably a
I think
little. He's probably like too universalist for your view and too like
yeah, yeah,
figurative and
that's
some.
correct. I think
Yeah,
he leaned. I think that the way he would say that God is the ground of all being, I think what he's just saying is the the ground of all being is what we label God, rather as I would say it is, God is the ground of all being. You see the difference?
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's definitely
Yeah.
how he says it. But he thinks that like um he's got like really extreme views about like you shouldn't even use like analogies to being a person because it's just going to confuse people. And so he thinks like apologetics, Christian apologetics, has been in a state of failure for like millennia,
Ugh.
and that like so yeah, he's probably like pretty
Well,
extreme
yeah.
from
Well,
your
the funny
perspective.
that he should say that because God uses plenty of analogies to communicate about Himself.
Yeah,
God certainly does not speak of Himself univocally, right? So, as Van Til would say, or Aquinas would say, God has to communicate to us in analogical terms, right? How could God speak to us in non-analogical terms in a univocal way when God's attributes are just simply, in terms of what He knows about Himself, unfathomable for us? In other words, if God spoke univocally about Himself, He would be speaking exhaustively, but we could never, because of our minds, understand God exhaustively like He exhaustively understands Himself. So God, in order to communicate to us, he has to condescend to us and speak analogically to us about himself. Now, there is a bit of dispute on Van Til's view about that with, I think, the theologian Gordon Clark, where they had a bit of a beef about that. But interestingly enough, I think they weren't there two brothers. There were the Tillich brothers, and they were both theologians. Am I mistaken about that?
Oh, that's a good question. I want to say yes, but it's very, very hazy.
Yeah.
I just read Paul's
Yeah, he
book.
didn't have he didn't have theological views that in my poor recollection in the past reading about him that I would agree with, but nonetheless he was a brilliant thinker. Just like Karl Barth was a brilliant
Oh yeah.
thinker. Barth was a brilliant theologian. However, fundamentalist Bible believing theologians would take great issue with some of Barth's
Yeah.
ideas.
It's like whole
But
neo-orthodoxy. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I mean, people can be brilliant. We can disagree with them, So,
But
interestingly enough, the Supreme Court referred to Tillich's idea about ultimate concern when they were deciding on whether or not an atheist can be a conscientious objector, which requires a deeply held religious conviction. If somebody doesn't believe in God, can they have a deeply held religious conviction? And that's why they incorporated some of Tillich's ideas.
mm. I did want to ask you a question. It's about like a troll question that people sometimes ask. I want to know like how you would respond to it if you had to. I understand if you just don't
Yeah.
even want to touch it.
Well, troll questions aren't always the content of the question. It's the attitude and motivation sometimes.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's a question, sometimes it's the attitude, the motivations. Anyway, go
Yeah.
ahead, but I'm going to be going to bed in like 5 minutes.
So I just want to like strip away. It's meant to be like a vulgar question, so I'm just going to like strip that away. Does
Be-
does does God know about what it's like for humans to experience certain things, like
yes,
sexual experiences? God knows
yes,
about that.
yeah.
Okay. Yep.
He doesn't know because he's experienced himself, but he knows exhaustively what it's like for people to experience physical sensation because he created every part of sensation. So how could he not know?
Is God a gendered being like a male? Is he beyond that, how does that work?
No, God is neither male nor female, but he has chosen to designate himself in male terms.
Oh wait,
Yeah.
so Darth, just a quick one. You would say that God doesn't know what it's like to sin, though, right? Did you say that?
No, no, God knows because he's omniscient, but he doesn't know what it's like to sin because he can't sin.
So sorry, what was the distinction there? Could you draw that a little bit more clearly for me?
Well, for example, do you remember when God said about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? God said, they have become like us, knowing good and evil. Well, man was meant to discern evil, but not to know it experientially. So God can know exhaustively what it is like to sin, but he can't know what it's like experientially because he can't sin.
Oh,
Isn't
okay.
that like a contradictory counterfact? Like
No.
the way I thought about this question was like God would know, like God the Father would know what it's like for a human being to experience something. But like God the Father doesn't have a body. So there's like no sense in which God the Father would know what it
Well,
would be like for God the Father to have that kind of an experience, because that kind of experience
this is a
requires a
moot
body.
point because God is entirely self-conscious of himself, and because his mind is what determines what comes to pass. This is how he has omniscience. Okay, but the fact that he exhaustively knows everything doesn't mean that he knows certain things by virtue of experiencing the activity in actuality. So God cannot know what it is like to sin because experientially, because God can't sin against himself.
I guess I think it's a contradiction in terms to even think of like God thinking about himself sinning. Like I don't think you can even think about that. To me, that's like thinking like a round
it's
circle.
theologically incoherent.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Is God an all-loving being, or is God's love exclusive to his elect, or how does that particular theological thing work?
Well, I'm not a Calvinist, but um, I believe I hold to corporate election as opposed to individual unconditional election, or as what Ken Wilson, the theologian, or excuse me, philosopher, says, divine unilateral predetermination of an individual's eternal destiny. Okay, so the Bible says, "For God so loved the world." Okay, so among Bible believing Christians, um, with the exception of Calvinists, Bible believing Christians would say, yes, God does love everybody, but that they will not receive the application of the love that God has expressed in salvation, because God has a stipulation that in order to receive it, you need to repent, right? Whereas the
Right.
Calvinists would say, no, God only loves the elect. What's funny though is once you study Calvinism pro and con and you become experienced in it, what you find is that the typical debate over Calvinism starts with certain Bible verses, and then it very quickly morphs into a theological and philosophical dispute. But if you're wise, you just simply stick to the text. What does the text say? What is the semantic range? If one is going to pick one semantic range over another in a particular verse, what's the rationale for that? Okay. But if you don't do that, it's easily to get sucked into the Calvinism, non-Calvinism in a theological, philosophical dispute, which doesn't really resolve the matter. The only thing that can resolve the matter is, what does the Bible say? Like, for example, in John 6:44, it says, "No man can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him." Um, every Calvinist I talk to thinks that that is referring to irresistible grace. But when we look at the context, it doesn't necessitate that. Okay. Semantically, it could mean that, but it doesn't necessitate that. Right? Or like when Jesus said to the apostles, "You did not choose, I chose you. You didn't choose me, I chose you." And then they will use that as an example of unconditional individual election. But in that passage, it's not talking about that. He's simply talking of his sovereign choice of their apostleship. Anyway, I'm going to bed, but it never ceases to amaze me the level of dishonesty, evasion, obfuscation, prevarication of unbelievers. Okay. Now, of course, people accuse me of falsely accusing these people just because they merely disagree. But it amazes me that even those kinds of people don't recognize the level of dishonesty that I have to deal with on a day in, day out basis. All right. See you guys later.